Good morning again, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for coming. We are opening the first debate in the framework of a working breakfast. You may remember that 20 years ago, the world looked much better than now. Europe was also a peaceful and prosperous corner, and it was still full of hope. Specifically, Central European countries were eager to join the European Union. Paradoxically enough, NATO membership came first in 1999, but in 2004, Central European countries became full members of the European Union. In Czech case, it was a referendum held, and the results were overwhelming. It was more than 70% absolutely for the full membership. Since things started to go in a wrong direction sometimes, what used to be marginal extremist parties in some of our countries slowly became almost a mainstream. And the question we are going to discuss here during this panel is what happened? What happened and what's the situation now? And I'm glad that we have here four friends coming from different corners of Europe, two from Central Europe, two from Western Europe, and let me introduce them. Mr. Sławomir Sierakovsky is the head of Krytyka Polityczna, which is the movement of liberal intellectuals, artists, and activists based in Poland, and the director of Institute for Advanced Studies in Warsaw. He has a monthly column in the international edition of the New York Times. Welcome, Mr. Sierakovsky.
And actually in Project Syndicate, that is the organizer, so maybe good to mention.
Yeah.
And I prefer my editors in Project Syndicate, of course, sitting there, Jonathan Stein.
And the next speaker will be Zsuzsanna Szelényi. She's a member of a Hungarian parliament representing the party Együtt, meaning together. And she was the member of the first freely elected parliament in 1989, and she holds the degrees in psychology and international politics and economics, and she'll be willing to tell us about the situation in Hungary. And then we have two guests, one from Portugal and one from Great Britain. Mr. João Espada is the director and founder of Institute of Political Science at the Catholic University in Portugal, and he's a professor of political studies. He studied in Oxford with Lord Ralph Dahlendorf, and he was lecturing at Brown, Stanford, and Georgetown universities in the United States. He published a series of books, and he also served as an advisor to two Portuguese presidents. And his point of view will be very interesting for us too. And finally, let me introduce Mr. Hugo Droshen, who is the fellow researcher at the Cambridge University. Welcome.
Thank you.
And in 5 minutes opening notes, every speaker will give his or her view of the situation, and then I'll give the floor to the audience. So please.
Hi, hello. Thank you very much, the organizers, for inviting me. I'll try to be really brief, though 5 minutes never works, so don't believe it. Well, I can only say on behalf of Poland, the region of Central Eastern Europe is more disorganized and disintegrated than the entire European Union. So-called the narcissism of small differences really works here, and the sovereignty question that makes sovereignty such a big dream for Poles and probably for other nations. It's works as a kind of a complex that it's much harder for these nations, for those countries to for example, to support the really strong political integration of EU, which is a very bad news now. when Eurozone, according to the Jean-Claude Juncker or Emmanuel Macron's plans that wanna, taking this lesson from this region, integrate only around the Eurozone. But just to give you two possible explanations, what happened, and basing on Polish experience, there are two schools. One says that the transition, that especially in Poland, was a shock therapy transition, much more neoliberal than neoliberalism you could find even in the United States. Usually the capitalism and any ism is much stronger on peripheries than in the center. We want to be better students than the students inside the center. And the syllabus in 1989 was the end of history, the apogee of economic liberalism, and all of it that you might not remember anymore, but it was really the only possible transition theory at that time. So one explanation is that shock therapy was so strong, dividing the society for winners and losers of transition so harshly that what we observe now is a kind of a populist reaction to it. The reservation is that if you look at the figures of the party that lost to Kaczynski party 2 years ago, you find a country that was probably the strongest in OECD according to the economic growth that accumulated 2008, 2014, in those 8 years, was 25% almost. For sure, the best result in EU. Also, the unemployment went down from 15% to around 9%. Now it's even 7%. It's better than in France, for example. And the deficit went down from 8 to less than 3. This was the only country without recession during the financial crisis. And also, you might ask, what about the inequalities? Gini coefficient was better. There was no really inequalities at this time. And this party lost election, both, after 8 times defeating Kaczynski before, 8 times in a row. Well, so this works against the first explanation, this neoliberalism explanation or the consequence of it. But the answer to it could be, look at the public polls now. If you look at the people who are the poorest in Poland, if you divide Polish society to 3 classes, in the poorest or popular class, the ruling party gets 60%. The former Tusk party gets 6%. If you look at for example, like the business, which is usually very opportunistic, okay? And the best prices in like who is the winner of the year goes to Kaczynski even before the before election that he won. When the public polls were showing that he's gonna win, the best prize in the business went to the man who didn't anything for the economy. But if you look at the public polls, they will show you that for the question, do you want to continue the government of Kaczynski, only there's 0% of the people asked in the business area would support Kaczynski again. If you ask them, do you want to come back to the previous government, 60% says yes. Okay, so 60% here, 60% here. It shows you like a class war in Poland. Briefly, second explanation would be identity explanation. Well, people say in this country, at least 1/3 of people are just nationalists, tough nationalists. no matter what's happening, when they have an opportunity to support someone like Kaczynski, they will do it. So he doesn't have supporters, he has believers as the only person on a political scene. Okay, then he needs like 5, 8, 10% more to get majority in a parliament. So actually, well, probably the combination of those two explanations would work. Just to give you some kind of public polls support to this second school. Refugees. Polls are first of all, I will tell you something about the Polish attitude towards EU. Polish society is not Euro enthusiastic. They are Euro fanatics of EU. 88% supports European integration in Poland among the society. You don't find those numbers in any other country. In the same time, when they were asked, do you accept refugees in Poland, even if would you reject would you reject refugees even if it costs Poland losing of Euro funds, and Poland is the biggest beneficiary of Euro funds in the EU? 52% answers yes, we can resign, but we don't want to have refugees in Poland. When they are asked, do you want to, if the cost would be leaving EU, 58% accepts it, or the opposite. But anyway, more than majority of Poles accepts both, losing funds, losing EU. And the EU is the only condition of independence for this country and security. It's not only the question of economy, okay? It supports the second explanation. But which one is the right one? We can discuss it. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Ms. Seleni, please.
Thank you very much. Good morning for everyone. I try to give a kind of complementary picture to what Sławomir told about you on Poland. And I find useful for all of you to learn about Hungary, because Hungary is a social and political laboratory. It has actually been that in the 30s, so Hungary is a small country in Europe, but actually what happened in the 30s from the periphery went to the mainstream Europe later. Hungary was a laboratory of the communists in the 80s called Gulyás communism, when we tried out how to be a bit more freer. So we Hungarians, we often felt ourselves, like in my lifetime, very fortunate. And we were very fortunate together with the Poles at the regime change. And now in less than 30 years, we are here and we can tell you how things can get bad. Because now Hungary is a laboratory for the populist state. The populist state, I would say, is an alt democracy. If you know alt-right, then I can say it's an alternative to democracy. Is it a democracy? Yes, it is a democracy. It actually looks like a liberal democracy. It has everything what a liberal democracy in Europe has a main feature. Hungary's institution system, born at the regime change, is a liberal democracy. It's perfect. Anyone can come and check it. We keep all the rules, so-called European rules. If you listen to the Hungarian politicians from Fidesz party, they speak a European language. We are good Europeans. We look like liberal democracy, but actually Hungary is not a liberal democracy any longer. I will tell you a bit why is it and how is it possible, because I think this is a case study that is interesting for everyone to follow. So while it looks like a liberal democracy, it has a very strong concentration of power of a certain political class, which is much narrower than what we have 10 or 15 years ago. So the concentration of power is one of the main features of the populist state. It's incredibly corrupt. It does not only concentrate power, but also resources and wealth. Hungary, in the last 7 years, become an oligarchic state. However, we do not have any culture of this. Central Europe is not an oligarchic system than like Russia or Ukraine. But it's possible to do it. Just to channel, let's say, European funds to certain groups, it's now an oligarchic country. So there are 5-10 oligarchs who actually possess a private property in huge amount. And it's now closer to Russia than ever before. It's maneuvering in the international landscape, and it's publicly anti-European, which is interesting because just as in Poland, Hungary is a very, very pure pro-European population. And still the government is able to speak up against Europe on a daily basis. And Brussels is considered just as Moscow was discussed by the opposition 30, 40 years ago. So people are able to live in contradictions, and they are able to believe in different things at the same time. This is also something very important for the populist state. So why the democratic institutions were not a bit more resilient, and why people accept this? This is the interesting question. And we've been obviously doing this for many years now, since Hungary is now a matured populist state. So we are considering and studying what happened to us. And I can just give you a couple of ideas how, since the transition, how we proceeded, not so much on the economic terms, but more on a social level. So, for example, Hungary went through a very tough, a quick, fast, and efficient privatization process in the 90s. This created Hungary a market economy, so we were very happy. We were really leading in Central Europe. But how does it really happen? Who were the ones who could profit from privatization? It were many of the former communist elite. So actually, among the first capitalists in Hungary, many of them were the Communist Party apparatus. So there was a very morally questioning thing about the privatization and capitalism as it is. So capitalism today is really not very nicely accepted in Hungary. And this, we rarely speak about that, but this was morally questionable. It was incredibly opportunistic. Speed was more important in order to get the FDI from Western Europe. The other thing is the historic justice. Eastern European countries managed the historic justice in different way, and I can tell that Hungary made it in the worst way. We did not have an appropriate lustration law. Communist apparat people, not from the top level, but from the second level, could come back to politics right from the early 90s. So the Socialist Post-Communist Party got to power at 1994, very quickly after the regime change. And property was not appropriately returned to people, so we had a lot of problem about property issues. Secret police files were never published. It can be researched, and it's an incredible moral hazard still today. So someone who is on power can use this as a tool to corrupt people. But I give you a concrete example. In 2002, the prime minister, actually a post-communist prime minister, turned out to be an agent. What happened? Nothing happened. He had to resign 2 years later because of different reasons, but actually there was no consequence. So again, to the privatization moral problem, the historic justice was also created a moral question. It's a country, people understood this is a country of no consequences, and this is a problem when you want to go through. Well, I try to be fast, But Hungary became very quickly a bipolar system. The elite has been traditionally divided in Hungary between urban and rural elite, and this was translated into party structure at the regime change. Just imagine how easy today this translates into populism, because if in a bipolar system, and this is true in Britain and true in the United States, it's so easy to say that the other part is the evil. You know, if you are not on equal footing, then the other part is the evil, and you are there, you are the top populist. And one thing what probably is one of the most important and pretty same in the Eastern European region is an incredible lack of social capital. We don't trust anyone. We don't trust each other. We don't trust the institutions. So here we are. The wonderful liberal democratic institutions never really worked because we never really believed in them. So it's very easy to topple them now. Viktor Orban is just placing his friends to the Constitution Court, the chief prosecutor, the judiciary system, the media authority, and everywhere. And then he is the only boy in the city. So. Of course, then we suffered from the crisis, unlike Poland, very heavily. So at 2010, it was pretty easy to take over the government and take over the entire country, because he said the regime change was compromised, and he is then the moral hero. And I think this is, we often do not understand that populists demonstrate themselves as moral heroes, and this is an important reason why they are so much liked, even if they actually take our freedom. So what can be done? I say a few words, and probably there will be more discussion about that, because that is the interesting issue. Because how can we rebuild social trust, which is the basis of the opportunistic attitude of populists? The lack of social trust. This is really the most difficult, because this is a kind of leftover of communism. It was communism when we learned how to avoid rules, how to be cherry pickers, which most of the Eastern European countries are with the European Union money, how to be opportunistic, how to be hypocrites. This is what we learned during communism, and this is the most complicated to change now. So both our local elite and the international elite, if we want to do something, we have to cooperate. In multi-layer level. We cannot do this alone in Hungary. We need support, and we can tell what kind of support you can give. And this is an institution, transparent and demanding institutions at European level. There is no institution at the European level which can make even a little comment on what is going on in Poland and Hungary. The European Union is in a constitutional crisis, because it is completely unable to even politically respond to anything what is happening in our countries. And they are turning their eyes away because they are so unable to do. But it should not be like this. I mean, everyone should be a bit more brave. Of course, lots of opportunism that we are facing here are there in other European countries as well. So it's really time to get together to look at all these reasons which are lying behind the story and create new coalitions. For example, just one example, I think this tribal party system in Europe is really disastrous. So centrist parties who take themselves seriously should get together finally. And Christian Democrats and liberals and social liberals should realize what is the real threat in Europe and political sense now. This is autocracy and authoritarianism, and we do have to act together. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for giving us a Hungarian perspective. Now, the floor is for you, Professor Espada.
Thank you. Well, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me. It's a great pleasure to be here. I noticed that the title of this discussion was mainly about Central Europe, And I must present a disclaimer at the very beginning, because I don't know really much about Central Europe. I have a strong connection with Poland because I taught at the College of Europe in Warsaw for 3 years, but I can't really say that I, know the details of the political evolution in both Poland and Hungary. Of course, I follow the events from afar. I share your concerns about the recent political developments in Central Europe in general, especially Poland and Hungary. But I'm not a specialist on that. So I thought, what should I do, really? I prepared 4 brief remarks that I thought might be useful to open up a conversation. But of course, after your 2 very impressive and touching presentations, I would like to, before my 4 remarks, I would like to say that I fully share your concern with the recent political evolution in both Poland and Hungary. Now to introduce some other points. So I have 4 brief remarks. One is very general, and it's actually related to Ralph Dahrendorf, whom you kindly mentioned was my supervisor. And Dahrendorf, as you know, was a liberal public intellectual and a scholar, and he was both German and British. And perhaps because of that, rich experience and perspective, he was, I remember him being always very concerned with something that he said was very common in continental European politics, mainly in Germany, and that he thought in the British tradition has been avoided. And what was that? That was what he used to call unfortunate dichotomies. That we in the continent have a certain tendency to create dichotomies. It's either tradition or change, either tradition or progress, either revolution or counter-revolution. And he was always, trying to draw my attention to this unfortunate dichotomy habit. And he said we should avoid unfortunate dichotomies, and namely, one of the unfortunate dichotomies he used to mention that we should avoid was the dichotomy between what he called populism and vanguardism. We should try to avoid that and try to, because the result of that dichotomy is, Dahrendorf used to say exactly what our speaker from Hungary has just mentioned, the weakening of the vital center. We need a strong center with with the left of center and the right of center components, different but solidly at the center. So we need to reinforce the center and try to avoid unfortunate dichotomies and the extremes. Now, the second point that I'd like to make, and I think is related to this, and that Dahrendorf used to make too, was that one of the crucial ingredients for avoiding unfortunate dichotomies should be a very clear-cut distinction between constitutional politics and normal politics. Constitutional politics is about the rules of the game, and on those rules we cannot compromise, and we should not compromise. And of course we all know what constitutional politics is about. It's about the rule of law, separation of powers, representative government, freedom of expression, freedom of conscience, freedom of expression, freedom of association, freedom of religion. So these are the fundamental constitutional rules that we should not compromise, or we should defend at all costs. But on the other side, these general rules allow the day-to-day competition between rival policies. And those policies are not at the level of constitutional politics. What does this mean? It means that in a constitutional democracy, we actually face decisions and choices that, with which we very often may disagree. I mean, sometimes our proposals will win elections, sometimes our proposals will lose, and we have to be prepared to live with that in a constitutional democracy. So what I'm saying is, I think it is important to distinguish between two levels and accept that in a normal democracy there will be policies, that there will be electoral results with which we very often may disagree. Now, my third point, now we'll get more specific, is about the European project and how these two former brief remarks are related to the European project. I think how can I put this? I mean, I think that we should not identify the cause of the European Union with a particular direction for the European project, namely this idea of an ever closer union. If we identify the European project with a specific purpose and a specific end state to be achieved, I think we are confusing normal politics with constitutional politics. End states to be achieved are not part of constitutional politics. They are part of the rivalry at the normal politics level. What I mean by this is that you can, or you should be able to be a committed Europeanist and at the same time being against more supranational integration. We need a dialogue and a discussion between at least two, and probably more specific views about policies for the European Union, and we should avoid this tendency to associate the European Union with more supranational integration. If we don't do that, I'm afraid what we may get is more Europe with fewer Europeans, and in a way, I think, well, my fourth and final remark will then be about the national sentiment that was mentioned, namely about Poland. And what I'd like to say is that, actually, I'd like to quote this Prague Appeal for Democratic Renewal that was signed here in Prague last May, and which I actually signed too. And one of the points that the Prague Appeal makes is about national identity. And it says, and I quote, "While democracy embodies universal values, democracy exists in a particular national context, what Václav Havel called the intellectual, spiritual, and cultural traditions that breathe substance into it and give it meaning." National identity, and then it concluded, national identity is too important to be left to the manipulation of despots and demagogic populists. So I would like to make a case for the importance of national identity national sentiment being associated with liberal democracy. And and so I think we should avoid the unfortunate dichotomy between nationalism and democracy, and we should try to fight against ethnic and, of course, xenophobic nationalism, but not against the national sentiment.
Or just nationalism and patriotism.
Yeah, or we could introduce that distinction, nationalism and patriotism, and being in favor of patriotism against nationalism. Okay.
Thank you very much. Mr. Hugo Droshin, please.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for coming at such an early time on a Monday morning. I also should start with a caveat, which is like my previous speaker as well. Although I think at a certain point the title of this panel had Central Europe in brackets. So I'm hoping that I'm going to try to fill that space which is in the brackets, because I too am not an expert at all, and we've heard some very touching and very profound remarks on Hungary and Poland. But what I thought I'd try to do is offer a slightly more of a comparative perspective. I'm kind of more of a specialist of Western Europe, France in particular, and UK to a certain degree. And the other thing I would say is that, of course, when you're last in the panel, a lot of things have already been said and been fantastic, so I'm going to echo some of them, some of the points that have been made. But I suppose the one point I did want to underline is that I think this, if we try to make a distinction in many ways between Western and Central Europe, of course there are differences, but at the same time I think there are certain fundamental trends that are valid for both sides. And I think we shouldn't forget, for instance, that during the last French presidential election, until about 1 week before the first round of the vote, it was Marine Le Pen who was actually leading the polls. Right, so this is something that's been very strong in Western European politics too. Why is it the case? And we've heard things already about how Poland has evolved, but since either the end of World War II or the fall of the Berlin Wall, we've gone through this big transformation, which normally people describe as globalization, which has been fantastic for overall for everybody, but within that there has been winners and losers. And I think we mentioned also, when you talk about Hungary, there's been winners and losers of this transition to capitalism. And I just wanted to mention one. I've done some work with YouGov, which I don't know if many of you heard of YouGov, but it's a big polling company in the UK. And what we studied is we studied the beliefs in conspiracy theories across Europe and in the UK. Okay, and if you want to think about the relationship between conspiracy theories and the moment, our current political moment, I don't think you need to go much further than, on one hand, the Brexit vote, or the other hand, the President of the United States, who is a clear political conspiracy theorist, who even actually launches his political career with the birther movement, which challenged where Barack Obama was born. But we found certain things which I thought were interesting and relevant to our discussion today. The first is that the people who tend to believe conspiracy theories are people who do not vote at all. So I think what we see is that the people who felt that they've lost out on the recent developments are people who've excluded themselves from politics altogether. And this was a survey that was done in 2016. It was before the Brexit vote, but already you could see how in many ways, some of the trends that would concretize themselves during the Brexit vote. So for UKIP voters, 82% of UKIP voters believed that there was an EU plot to take over the United Kingdom, on the one hand, and 82% also thought that the government was lying about the number of immigrants there were in the country. 82%, okay? Conservative voters thought both of these things, believed these two statements at 55%. You could see already, this is March 2016, the Brexit vote was in June, you can see already how these developments were coming through. And also to echo what was said about Hungary, also in the West, Western Europe, we have a growing distrust of political institutions. And so that people who are most likely to be conspiracy theorists are people who have a fundamental distrust of all political institutions and generally reject democracy as a whole. So there are people who've dropped out of politics, who feel excluded politically and economically. And that is a trend that I think we see across Western and Central Europe. What does that mean? I think the kind of thesis I want to offer you to think about is whether we are going through a fundamental realignment of the politics we've experienced since the Second World War. That is to say, we have used to thinking of politics as a conflict between the left and the right, but I think a lot of voters precisely, those who felt that they've lost out, have voted for left-wing governments and right-wing governments and don't feel that they've gotten something out of it. So they're willing to try something new. And that novelty often comes in the sense of populists who reject everything that the right and the left often represented, which is why the EU is often such a target of populist hate, because the EU in many ways has been a consensus between left-wing and right-wing parties, mostly across Europe. they're willing to try something new, but it doesn't necessarily mean to say, and this is hopefully a slightly more positive point, it doesn't necessarily mean to say that novelty has to be incarnated in the types of populist leaders we have seen across Western and Central Europe. We have also seen that novelty can take the form of somebody like Emmanuel Macron in France, who is a liberal, centrist liberal. And the French election is interesting in that sense that behind Marine Le Pen for a long time it was the right-wing candidate François Fillon who people thought were going to win. But then this whole Penelope Gate scandal erupted, I don't know if you're aware of that, which is that he was employing his wife to do a job that she wasn't doing at all. And this was very symptomatic because the French, this represented the old way of doing politics in France, and people were fed up with that. They wanted something new. That's why he had to step aside. In many ways, then Emmanuel Macron was able to incarnate that center that didn't exist before. So that's the main claim, which has been already suggested before, which is I don't think we're now looking at politics as an organization of left versus right. We're looking at an organization of politics which is rather center versus extreme. So we have to rethink our political geography. I think that's important to realize. And what's important to realize is both the center and the extreme depend. The people who claim to be representing either the center or extreme, or we think are representing the center or extreme, both of them are actually claiming to represent the center. So in France, Marine Le Pen claims to be representing the old French center of France, the Francs, the white people, etc. That's what she's claiming to represent the center, which for us, if I may say that statement about everyone here, for us probably sounds a bit more like an extreme. Whereas Emmanuel Macron represents more the center that we tend to associate, which is a center which is a pro-European kind of liberal center. So there's a real struggle going on. I think that's how we need to understand, reconceptualize politics, to understand that that's the situation we're in. A situation is where there's a struggle between these two forces. And if we want one force to win, the centrist forces to win, then we have to think about how the center might hold in many ways. And I think it's been touched before also by Joao, which is that Emmanuel Macron was able to make the center hold because he was able to combine the center left and the center right forces, which have normally been split. And I think in this struggle to come, which is the situation we're in now, we really need to think about how we can bring the center left and the center right parties together. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Now let me open the floor for the audience. Please wait. My colleagues are bringing microphones, and as I repeat, just please.
Just briefly.
Yes, a brief reaction. Yeah.
Just like, let me do the brief reaction first. Like, don't take it wrong, but look, like when just about this Eastern Europe in brackets, like if it's gonna be Western Europe, you won't need brackets or just. It's funny because like if it's about Eastern Europe, you have to make this reservation that I don't know a lot. Please don't ask me about it. I can tell you quite a lot about France, Germany, or Brexit, but it doesn't go the opposite way, which tells you that the Iron Curtain, at least in this way, works again. To give you another, to provide you with another division that might work for you, would be that we don't have a left and right anymore, we have a right and wrong. Which works like this is kind of an anti-establishment agenda, okay? And to balance what you said about Dahrendorf in the same time was a founder of coercive theory in sociology. So he doesn't tell us only about unfortunate dichotomies, but his main point was we need to think about dichotomies. We have to think about a conflict in liberal democracy. And there was, 1989 was the moment of belief in the consensual theories. Habermas, Richard Rorty, like most of the theoreticians, John Rawls, were thinking that we can harmonize human interests, human opinions, and so on. So this was like the relaunching of enlightenment. So what is what's in a crisis now is this Enlightenment agenda that looks like a quite naive agenda again in a history. One point also, like in Eastern Europe, you had also laboratory in this way that liberalism, it's not necessarily that democracy is attacked by populist. It's more liberalism that it's attacked. Independent media, independent courts, like because populists, they know how to win elections. They can do it in an honest way, really. But what they try to do is to eliminate this liberalism agenda, not necessarily the democracy. And what was another lesson of 1989 was that it's quite easy to impose democracy. It's about procedures, okay? But it's much harder to implement liberalism because it's about the tradition, this practical knowledge, and this you need a lot of time really to do it. And it's not about procedures, okay? And then my last point is that there is a method to prove the conspiracy theory. Kaczynski was saying, listen, there's a lot of money for you, the people, but just they don't want to give it to you. Well, after he won election, he launched the largest social transfer in Polish history. He gave a lot of money to the people. His first point was, it's 500 plus program. So each person in a family that has a child gets 500 zlotys. Polish salary, it's like the most frequently paid salary is about 2,500 zlotys. For the person who gets 500 or 1,000, if she or he or both has two children, it's a revolution in a pocket, okay? And this way, you can really prove the conspiracy theory. Okay, because this is exactly how he proved. And the Polish budget works perfectly well again. We have a growth, we have everything. Polish economy survived these social transfers. What you can get more? The conspiracy theory became a truth now, retroactively.
Maybe.
Thank you.
Can I maybe also just comment on you, because I think that what you said really underlined, I think, our experiment. Whether Macron is the only hope in Europe so far. So we are all watching Macron. What did he do? Well, we hope there will be other Macrons sooner, so we can also see that this really works. Because when I said that it looks like liberal democracy, it is that exactly what Slavomir said. Both the Polish and the Hungarian government is based on middle class. These are not, when we call losers, it doesn't mean that this is a periphery of people. It's not the poor people. It's actually based on middle class. Viktor Orban's regime is absolutely centered, and he introduced a lot of social transfers. Because there's a playbook. I think I can recognize a playbook. Hungary started 7 years ago, and Poland 2 years ago, and all the methods are actually pretty similar. How to topple the institutions, and also why they are so popular is because they get a lot of money. So money for loyalty, that's the logic. And this is based on middle class. The same middle class, actually liberal democrats, the liberal democracy is based on traditionally. And this poses a lot of difficulty for us. And then, of course, how we demonstrate that the anti-pluralist, anti-liberal nature of these forces is a problem, and freedom is a basis for our existence and further development. Of course, in a couple of years, our societies will pay big price for these lost years.
Thank you. So your questions, please. Yes, please.
Sorry, I have the mic, so can I please do the first? Thank you very much for your speeches. My name is Alexandra Drik, and I'm the head of the anti-corruption NGO in Ukraine. So as you fairly mentioned, Ukraine is an oligarchic state, and the key for Ukraine to turn into a democratic state now is building basically institutions from scratch. Since the Euromaidan revolution, we obviously now understand that we cannot reform the existing institutions, we can only build them from scratch. And one initial question that I was intending to ask you is basically how to protect those new institutions that we are currently building. Now I see that you face the similar problems yourselves. So basically what I would like to learn, given your experience, especially those countries that have joined the EU more recently and are now going through difficult stages in their histories themselves. What can be done on national and international level to protect those institutions that are aiming to change the state of affairs in the country like Ukraine, to your point of view? Thank you.
And it's addressed to...
Shall we collect some?
To me? I mean, actually my organization, to tell you something, is not Polish, it's more Polish-Ukrainian. Like we always tried, when everybody went west in Poland or looked west, we looked east because it was much more ambitious. And we have cultural centers in many cities in Poland, but we have one in Kiev also, and we try to do what is possible for Ukraine, like Tim Snyder and many other people who works with us. Well, actually Ukraine in 1989 was on a higher level than Poland. And I'm not sure about Hungary and Czech Republic, but Ukraine was like a quite modernized country. But the problem is what I pointed out before with democracy and liberalism. It's quite easy to impose to implement the procedures. It's much harder with the social trust, with everything that it's like invisible among the people. This is why what we're building there, it's the attitudes of people. It's the social bonds rather than procedures. Well, Poland has a lot of sins in our history, and Ukraine was exactly this part when it looked the most harshly, because like Poland, if you look in the 16th and 17th century, what was like the suicidal tendency in a Polish history was oligarchization. And it killed Poland, and now it's killing Ukraine. It killed Poland, especially in this eastern part, when Ukraine was part of this Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. It's much hard. Well, and in the same time, what's the lesson of? We talk a lot in Poland about Polish 40s and 50s, when we had a lot of heroes still fighting with communists after the war, which was just impossible, and so on and so on. And Polish right is talking about it all the time. We don't talk about Polish 30s. And the lesson of Polish 30s was, in this part of Europe, you cannot be nobodies. If you're not Eastern Europe, a part of Western Europe, or like strongly connected, you're gonna be this, like sooner or later, a part of or a satellite country to Russia. And for sure, Ukraine cannot do it alone. I mean, no modernization, no democratization will be there if it would depend only for Ukrainians. And it's not about Ukrainians. They're the same people like Poles. They're exactly the same human being. And I'm quite disappointed as for Western Europe and US in the same time, though US is much better than Western Europe. Just to tell you one more thing, never inside the EU people were fighting for EU so strongly as in Maidan. In Maidan, 100 people died under the flags of EU. And I think we also in EU forgot the main lesson. Why EU was created? Because Europeans wanted to have the welfare? No. Because they wanted to have democracy? No, of course it helps. But the main reason for creating EU was to prevent wars. Okay? Now we have a war. And we should be there. Or we should try to do what is possible for Ukrainians. They are the same people. They should be a part of EU.
Thank you.
Hello. My name is Martin Viktor. I'm from University of Economics in Prague. I have a question for panelists from Hungary concerning new media. Do they play some role in the, let's say, balancing of a mainstream representative of politics? I have a good experience here from Czech Republic that the new independent newspapers concerning investigation, all these things. Does it exist in Hungary, in Poland, something like that? Thanks.
Of course it exists.
Okay. Yes, of course, we have a lot of new media initiative, and their profile is very investigative. The problem is with new media, and then I think we all learned it from the US elections, that with Twitter, Facebook, or any online media works if it's multiplied by television. It's still the television that reaches the most people in the population. And a large part of the population is not online, specifically not reached by the new media, but actually watch the TV. So new media cannot reach the TV because that's blocked by the government. Public media is completely under control, and even after 6 years, the 80% of commercial media in Hungary is somehow in the hand of the network of the government, which is a really narrow space for new media, for the opposition, for NGOs, for investigative journalists. So, of course, this is a level of transparency, and we use this room as much as possible, still with limited success.
Thank you. I'm very sorry, but we will have to close down soon because the opening panel will start, and we have unfortunately no time for more questions. But on the other hand, I'm very glad that the team was attracting the interest of so many people, and I'd like to thank all panelists because you're absolutely right. You got that Central Europe was in brackets, and your comments from Western and Southwestern part of Europe were very, very important for us too. We have learned interesting things. For instance, that in Hungary we have nothing like liberal democracy any longer, but still we have democracy. And then the same team was developed by putting another polarity, liberalism, liberal democracy, and democracy. So that is probably streams influencing Central European, but also European politics recently. Yes, we know that we have to respect the basic framework, the constitutional politics, but the competition of political forces in such a framework under rule of law, it's something very normal. So we are not afraid of conflicts between political ideas, but what we are afraid of is the questioning of basis of democracy. And what we've also learned that very probably here in Central Europe, the shallow roots of democracy are illustrated by the fact that we do not believe institutions, but we have learned immediately that in Western Europe, in Great Britain, the lack of trust institutions is also something what is influencing everyday politics. And what is the great question mark is what will come next. Hopefully, we can still have some hope, and I wish you very interesting morning and afternoon today, and tomorrow it will be the closing debate. Thank you very much for your participation. Thank you.